Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Welcome to part 3 of this 4-part series on SAS. You're in for a great episode today, hearing from Ellie Freeman. She was another one of the panelists I met at Hamilton College in New York, who encouraged me to start this podcast. Ellie's story is one of triumph over tragedy. After being drugged and raped, Ellie has learned to thrive by sharing her story. It's an honor to have her as a guest on this show. Here's Ellie. Hello, Ellie Freeman. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's been a long time since we've seen each other. We've chatted a few times, but I just haven't seen you since we did that panel up in New York. So that was quite a few years ago.
Yeah, it was a long time.
I am just really thankful and appreciative and quite honored that you've agreed to do this interview with me. And I just want to acknowledge to our listeners that it was Ellie and the other 3 women on the panel that actually convinced me to do a podcast. So it's been a long time coming, but here we are, and I'm just honored to have one of those panelists with us today and to have her talk about her experience. But also we'll talk about where she's at today and how she's been able to get to the point where she's not only functioning, but thriving. I think that's an important part of this. So Ellie, thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Ellie, what are you able to tell us about your experience?
When I think back about it and think about talking about it, it's like I remember a lot of what happened, and then there are some things that I just are such blurry memories. But I went to college at Syracuse University, and my first semester there, my freshman year, was pretty good. I was just settling in and getting to know everyone in my hall, and it was a co-ed dorm room. And so our neighbors to the left of us were guys, and neighbors to the right of us were guys. And so the second semester rolls around, and one of the neighbors right to my left of my dorm room was very friendly and just kind of always tried to include people to his dorm room for just events and just hang out and everything. And so one night, it was a Thursday night, and I remember because I didn't have any classes the next day, and that was still a novel thing for me, just being new to college. And so I went over to his dorm room. It was him and a few other friends, and we were just kind of drinking and just having a good time. And then I remember him asking if I wanted a shot of a cinnamon alcohol that he said he had made. And so I was kind of hesitant, but I figured, why not? It looked like him and his friends were doing it, so took a shot of that. And then from that then on is where it just gets really kind of fuzzy and in and out in my experience. There are some things that I remembered later on. There are some things that I'm still kind of did this happen? Did this not happen? What kind of... It's just a very strange feeling because I was drugged, and it was very clear to me the next day that that's what had happened. And basically I got sick, and he walked me back right next door to my bed, and my roommate wasn't there. And so I got into my bed, and I was really remember just my body feeling so heavy, and I couldn't really move, but I was very aware that I did not want him in my room. And then he started to assault me, and it was again that feeling of I can't move my body. I'm so in and out of consciousness, kind of. I knew that I didn't like what was happening, and then that stopped at some point, and then he left, and I just kind of panicked because I was just what just happened? I was still just very unclear. And so I actually called my brother that night. And my brother is 2 years older than me, and he was in college himself at the time. And I remember calling him, and he was out at a party or something. So he was drinking as well, but he was there to talk to me. And I just kind of remember telling him I didn't want this to happen. The person that I'm not going to say the name on here, but the person that did this to me lives right next door to me. I don't know what's going on. Just kind of very unclear. And just like, as I'm talking about it now, I feel like I'm sounding very unclear too, because it's just like, trying to recall these memories is like frustrating.
Yeah.
So that was the first situation. And then I kind of went into a downward spiral of just like, I think it was a lot of blame, because when I woke up in the morning, I had gotten sick, and this neighbor guy next door had apparently helped to clean up. I mean, I puked. And so my roommate the next morning was very much blaming me. I woke up and she was like, we need to talk about what happened. I came home and apparently he had helped you get to the room because you were so drunk, and like, you really should apologize to him and thank him for helping you. And like, she was like, I felt like I was being lectured by my mother, and it was just very, for something that like you'd get in trouble for, that is truly like, you know, just as a kid, if you're getting yelled at, that's kind of how it felt. And it was like, I think that kind of steered me in a direction of like, okay, it was my fault. Maybe I was drunk. I totally started doubting everything that I knew in my gut. So it was very confusing. And looking back, it's just like the worst first response I could have had. And so I think that kind of led me into just a really bad place for the next few months of college. And there was another incident when I woke up and didn't really know what happened, and woke up in my bed naked and knew that something had happened. But again, my roommate, this was a few months later, and again, my same roommate was like, you're being irresponsible. You're putting me at danger by bringing people home. And I was like, listen, I said to her, I didn't know what happened. For all I knew, I went to bed alone. Like, I don't even know who was here. I don't know what had happened. I was like very upset by it. But also I took that to heart as like, I must have been too drunk and that was my fault. And so that was kind of the message that I was given just by her and by just some other friends at the time. So I still kind of struggle with that a little bit today of like, I know deep down that if someone else came to me and said that something happened, they're not quite sure what happened, but they think it was like an assault, or they woke up and were told that someone was in their bed, like I would be absolutely supportive of whatever they needed and say like, yes, this is not okay. But for me, it just feels it's that double standard. I feel like of like, when it's yourself, it's really harder to be nice to yourself.
Yeah.
And then there was one final situation in college that was actually more cut and dry, in the sense of like, neither of us were drinking, and it was very clear now looking back that I was raped. But in the moment, it was like, again, it was a friend. I invited him to come actually stay for the weekend. Someone I knew from somewhere else outside of college. And I was like, I'm not sure I want to do this. He's like, no, it'll be okay. Like, just that pressure. And then it's happening and I'm crying and very uncomfortable, and he's not taking any of those signs, and it's continuing. And it's just, like I said, clear to me now that that was absolutely not consensual sex, but another time where it took me so long to realize that like that was not okay and that it wasn't anything that I did wrong.
Yeah. All three of those situations sound extremely difficult, especially I am struck by the situations where you were drugged and the lack of consideration when someone does that to another person, and what they're doing is fulfilling their own needs and not caring at all about the other person, obviously. And that's obviously the crux of rape, having power and control over someone else.
Yeah.
When you think back on that first incident, that first experience, Ellie, are you able to tell in your own mind how much of your lack of memory is trauma-based and how much of it is drug-induced?
So there is like, when I think about it, which luckily I've had plenty of therapy and time, just the amount of time that's gone by and positive relationships now. And so luckily I don't think about it as much as I did, but like the days following that and the months and even years or so, I feel like I would just try to replay it in my head constantly, at least every day, if not more, just constantly trying to go through what happened, go through each piece. And like what I told you was not even the full, there are some parts that are just that I'd rather not talk about. But I think that in the moment, there was a lot of fuzziness of the drugs, that whatever it was that was clear to me that it was not just me being drunk. It was clear, so clear, especially the next day too, and just remembering that. But I think that there is some at least that I kind of have blacked out of my memory just through trauma. Even that part when I called my brother, I think a big reason of why I remember what happened in the moment is because I was able to have that kind of, I'm really grateful that I'm personally really glad that I called him, because then the next day when everything was so complicated and the days following, I had that kind of security of remembering, like, or having him be able to say, yes, you called me and you said this, you said you were assaulted, like you said that these things happened. And so I was able to have that memory. But I think that the actual memory of the event, of the situation that happened, I think a lot of that is a trauma, like fuzziness. Also, like some days I could sit and try to recall it better. Other days it's just like a big blur. That was a kind of a very complicated answer that maybe didn't even answer your question, but
No,
I think that, yeah.
I think it does a lot in terms of helping people understand. And one of the main things that I'd like to accomplish with this podcast is educating other victims and survivors about what their brain is doing and why it's doing what it's doing and how trauma affects our brain function. And when we're in trauma, and you know this from the training that I did that you were present for and other things that we've talked about, that one of the things that happens is the prefrontal cortex, the executive thought process of our brains, that generally is in control, that we control in terms of making decisions and thinking about consequences and figuring out what the best way to handle a situation is, that actually shuts down or is impaired to a large extent because of the trauma. And so you exacerbate that situation with a drug, and it makes it even worse, obviously. But we also know the neuroscience of trauma is that our brains, the amygdala portion of our brain and other parts that handle the trauma as it's occurring, collect information that the brain strives to compare to other situations for survival purposes. And one of the things that we know is that the senses, the sights and smells and sounds and tastes and touches and even body positions are recorded first and strongest by our brain during trauma.
Yeah.
So that leads me to some sensory type questions for you, Ellie. Are you able to remember any particular smells?
Yeah. So that one was, I think, one of the hardest, for the fact that I had a few months left of living in that same room right next to his room. And the smell of just like, it's hard to describe, but honestly, I feel like right now I can just like I just know exactly what it is. It's that smell of like alcohol, stickiness, of just like a college dorm, but his college dorm is just like the cinnamon mixed with sweetness, mixed with beer stained on the floor and like sweatiness, and just like the smell of that room. And like, I mean, it's kind of like the idea too, I feel like, that like when I go home to my parents' house and just like my laundry growing up smells the way that I just know that it smells, or like my grandma's house just has a smell to it. And those smells that we don't really, I feel like I never really paid attention to it as much, or never really realized how strong they can actually become until this happened, when I would walk past his room and just be able to smell that specific smell, that it was just so ingrained with that experience. And I think that a lot of the last few months in that dorm room, I think I don't know if I would say equally or not, but I think a lot of that was blacked out too, or like, I don't know if blacked out's the right word, but like a lot of those, my day in and day out in that college dorm room after the assaults is just so fuzzy and just so like, the trauma of walking past that room every single day, to go to my room, to be in a room with a roommate who fully blamed me. And like, I felt like she just like hated me because she thought I was just like irresponsible. And anyway, it's just like, yeah, that smell is really strong for me. And I think the visual, like, I might not be able to remember as much of all of what happened in that specific situation, but like if I like close my eyes and think about my dorm room and like the hall and his room and the bathroom, because that was a part of that experience, and just I feel like I can just see like the exact sheets I had on my bed and the clothes that I know the exact, I threw them out just like a year ago or 2 years ago, the sweatpants and the long sleeve shirt I was wearing, but I feel like I can almost feel those sweatpants on me and remember that shirt and those pants. And like, yeah, now I feel like I'm getting all wrapped up in it, because when you think about the senses, like those ones do come so strongly.
They not only come strong, but they also bring with it those feelings of being right back there in the moment and the trauma that involves. But the hope with this line of questioning is that, as you mentioned before, there are things that you'd prefer not to talk about, and that you get to regulate the level of re-experiencing that experience in terms of what you want for this moment in this interview. But I think it's important for people to understand that, yeah, that's really actually the way the brain works, is that it's absorbing and encoding and consolidating information in such a way that it's actually used by the brain for future survival and for recognizing situations that may need our attention in taking good care of ourselves.
Yeah.
You mentioned, though, even the touch, the feel of those sweatpants and the shirt that you had on. Are you able also to describe for us any body positions that you particularly remember?
Yeah, I remember so specifically of just my bed was up on like bed risers a little bit. So basically if someone's standing by the bed, it was like maybe chest height for this person who was similar to my height. So I remember I was laying in the bed just fully on my back, kind of like just in and out and just feeling dizzy and confused and all these horrible feelings. And I remember this person was standing right there right at the side of my bed while I was laying down. And yeah, I just remember that I was just laying in this position right on my back, and this person was just standing right there, like over me basically too. It felt like I was just kind of trapped because I was laying on the bed, and like if I tried, not that I was really going to be able to do anything, but if I tried to get out, it was like he was right there, almost like in this blocking position of like, nope, you're not leaving this bed.
I'm so sorry for the experience that you've had, and but at the same time, I'm very grateful that you are willing to share this, because I know there are listeners to this podcast who have similar experiences that maybe they've not worked through. And I know you have to a large extent, but there are things about trauma that are with us always. And I can hear in your voice that there's hesitation to go any further, and I appreciate that. And I thank you for taking care of yourself that way and recognizing what you can talk about and what you can't talk about.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting to experience this again. Like, I haven't talked really much about this. I did a lot of advocating in my senior year of college and a little bit after college, and periodically just some advocating here and there. But every time I talk about this, it's so difficult it's not only painful and like brings up just kind of like my body just gets tense, and I mean, I get anxious, but it comes out so unclear, at least in my mind. It comes out so jumbled. It comes out just like a word vomit of just like details happen. And then I'm like, oh, wait, but I forgot to say this thing that happened. And then it's like, oh, well, I can't say that now because I already told the story the way that I told it the first time. And so it's just like because there's so many pieces to the puzzle of assaults and rape and sexual violence. And there's so many things that there's so much stigma around, like, oh, people are going to lie about it, or you whatever. Just like, I feel like it's just such a difficult thing to talk about even years later because it feels so messy. That's how I can describe it, is that like even the way I'm saying it, and I'm sure when I listen back to this, I'll be like, yeah, it just sounds so jumbled and messy and confused and like, and that's how it feels jumbled and messy and confusing. And
Absolutely. I think that's important, though, for listeners to understand, those who've been through it, but even those who haven't, who are confused about why the story changes. And
yeah,
it's important for people to know that that's so common and so expected from those of us who know the neuroscience of the brain and how memory works. And I don't know if you'll remember this, but in the presentation I gave before the panel that you were on, I talked about that very thing and how there are certain memories that we absolutely know that we have, that we recall and can talk about them.
mm-hmm.
And yet there are other memories that are, and those memories that we know we have are called explicit memory. And then there are memories that are locked in our brain that we don't even know are there yet until something unlocks them, until a trigger or a smell or a sight or a sound, like you were just talking about, the feeling of those clothes and knowing exactly what they look like, and that smell that you can smell it even now.
Mm-hmm.
Those can trigger those implicit memories. And when those come out, and it can be years later, then it sounds like, oh, now they're exaggerating or they're embellishing, and really that is not the case at all. And I think it's really important for our listeners to understand that that's not what's happening. What's happening is the brain is actually in a place now where, based on what we're talking about, it is releasing those implicit memories, and then those implicit memories instantly become an explicit memory. We know it happened and we can talk about it. And
Mm-hmm.
I hear you doing that. It sounds to
Yeah.
me as though things are coming back to memory that you'd not talked about before. And
Yeah.
is there an example that you are willing to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely things that I think when I told this story the first time at one of those advocacy events, I feel like I tried to like keep it so simple. I tried to write it out and memorize how I was going to say it, even though that sounds, even saying that sounds like, oh, well, why do you have to memorize it? It's because I was so nervous and still am, even though I know all of what you said. And that's why we were, all four of us on the panel were like, this is eye opening and incredible and so relieving. But it doesn't take away the fact that it's still, that not enough people know that that this is the way it all works, because yeah, I just feel like there are so many things swirling around in my brain right now of like, oh, this moment that you didn't mention at the beginning, Ellie, or what about when you were laying in his bed and stuff started to happen then, and like all these different things. Or when, like, another example of that is like that I left out, partly because I kind of wasn't thinking about it specifically until then you said the sounds. And I remember the bathroom door of our dorm was so loud and would slam shut if you didn't like quietly shut it. And we had like 4 single stalls with showers. Before we went to my room, he'd walk me. I said I had to go to the bathroom. And so he would walk me into the bathroom, and just like the sound of that door slamming shut. But in this situation where I wanted to go in alone, I was like, no, I can do it. I can go to the bathroom on my own. He's like, no, I'm going to come in. So just stuff like that, where like those memories where the next day it's all so vague. But like you said, as things uncover it and things get worked through, or like the sounds you remember, the smells or things like that, start to bring it out. And then I don't know, even like, yeah, it's just so complicated. And like, even now I'm feeling so anxious because I'm like criticizing myself as I'm talking, and I'm like, you're sounding so jumbled and messy and that no one's gonna take you seriously. And so I'm kind of going through that right now in my head.
I so appreciate that, and I'm so thankful that you even articulated it, because again, this is for other victims and survivors who can't comprehend in their own head what in the heck happened, and why can't I talk about it, and why does it keep changing, and why do I keep remembering things that I didn't remember when I was talking to loved ones about this, or even the police, and then of course when it's law enforcement who happen to maybe be investigating something, and they hear weeks, months, maybe a year later, oh, I'd forgotten to tell you this, or I didn't remember this happened until just this morning and I needed to call you and tell you. And then law enforcement becomes suspicious or critical and think that, again, like I just mentioned, that you're embellishing or trying to add to the story to make it sound worse than it really was, to make it sound more important that they do something. And that's not the case. The case is that our brains are complicated and messy, and how we remember things is complicated and messy. And if people who are investigating this, or not necessarily investigating it, but are trying to reconcile certain aspects of who you are and why you are the way you are, if they don't understand these things, it can cause issues for you and in that relationship. And I think you know what I'm talking about. And it's hard to talk to other people about this. So I appreciate what you're doing and what you're saying. And I think it's important, like I said, for our audience to know these things. Thank you.
I think one thing that when I'm talking about all this is what I'm thinking of, I wish someone had kind of told me this. It actually happened a little less than a year ago. I was talking to someone because I had posted on Facebook and I go in waves of advocating and rolling it back. And someone had messaged me that I knew from high school and was like, thanks for sharing. This happened to me. And so we talked a little bit, and she was saying how she was so nervous to tell anyone because when she talked about it, the few times she did, she said that she would just get like stone cold, no emotion, roll through it as if like she was just reading like a script. And so I kind of really, really resonated with that, because even now before doing this, I was like, okay, well, I know when I talk about this stuff, I feel like my wall goes up in a sense of like almost like speaking about it as if it's like me telling someone else's story, because I don't want to get upset about it, or I don't, whatever it is. And so a lot of times I don't seem to get like emotionally upset about it. And like, I've been so hard on myself because I'm like, oh, well, clearly it's not that big of a deal if you're not going to cry about it, or if you aren't getting upset about it when you talk about it. And a lot of times I feel like then when I like hang up the phone or leave the conversation or leave the situation, then like it just is like, that's when it hits me, when I feel like I can be on my own and like safe. But that's another thing that like is so tricky, because I was thinking to myself, like, if I had to go report there, if I chose to go report this to like police officers or whoever it was, like, and I was talking like it wasn't really that upsetting to me, then it's like, that's a whole nother thing to be judged, like that I judged that like people were like, oh, well, how come you're not that upset? Why are you not? I don't know.
No, it's so common that people seem to think they have it figured out as to how someone who's raped should act and how they should respond when they're telling their story and what it should look like. And the truth of the matter is that everybody's response and the way they tell their story is different based upon a huge gamut of factors: personality and trauma response, and what that person's going through when they're telling the story. Reliving that trauma can have an effect on that person that listeners can't quite comprehend sometimes if they don't know what the trauma experience is like when someone's being raped.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's going to be a gamut of responses, and the relationship issues come into play too, in how we tell the story, depending on who we're telling that story to. And then there's the aspect of the memory. Like I said, certain things could be coming back, and we're not even sure that we want to articulate those all of a sudden implicit memories that come to light and now are explicit memories, because we don't quite know how that fits into the story. And it can confuse even ourselves and how we are interpreting what happens. The brain needs time to do what is called consolidating all of those thoughts, and sometimes even putting them into a perspective that makes sense to the victim. And that's not easy. It's not easy when it comes to trauma.
Yeah.
So what you're doing is making a lot of sense to me and those who are listening who know about trauma response and the neuroscience of memory and trauma. But for those who aren't, it's educational. And so I'm really grateful that you are so willing and open about this.
Thank you.
Can we talk for a minute about the fear response and what you felt fear-wise when this all started the first time?
Yeah. I think there's a few parts to that. A big fear for me was when I first felt like, well, when I took that shot of alcohol that was in like a mason jar that this person had made, just put drugs in, basically. I remember just a strange feeling of like losing control of my body because I was getting dizzy, and then I had to lay down. I was like, okay, hang on, I got to lay down. So I laid down on his bed, and then that felt scary of like, am I going to be able to get up? And that fear of not being able to control what I wanted to do was big. And then I remember the fear of it almost set in of like, something's going to happen just as he was taking my pants off, taking my clothes off. And I was just kind of like, it felt in my head like I was kind of trying to get to a place of like, okay, this is going to happen. Let's let it be quick and hope that it doesn't last very long and that it's not as bad as I imagine that it will be. And just that horrible, horrible fear of like the most intimate thing is about to happen with someone that you absolutely don't want it to happen with, and you know that they're not going to listen to you and say, and that whatever you say is not going to matter. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's a fear, it's a sadness, it's a confusion, it's like the strangest mix of emotions, for me at least. And on top of it, I had this strange, awful thing happening where I felt like I was stuck, like not just the freeze response, because that did happen in all three of my situations, but it also was like literally with whatever I had been given, I like wasn't going to be able to get up. I remember telling my brain, just get up, just move your legs over, just push them out of the way, just get up. But I like literally couldn't do that. And so it's a very scary feeling to be in.
It really is. And I don't know if you recall, again, in the training that I did, there's something called tonic immobility.
Yeah.
And it sounds to me, based on what I know about tonic immobility, that's what happened, is that your brain is saying one thing, but your body's not reacting. And
yeah.
This is a documented, researched response of the body in the sense of feeling trapped in a situation, of the brain feeling as though it's in a highly dangerous situation and that there is no escape. And sometimes escape is right there, it's available, but we as victims can't utilize our bodies the way we would want to, because of either tonic immobility, and there's something else called collapsed mobility. Very similar situation, but it's a physiological response to a psychological terror. And I think you have articulated it very well.
Thank you.
It's exactly what probably happened in your situation. And it's also, I think other listeners need to know, it's a common response in a trauma situation where one is facing emotional injury or physical injury. There are documented experiences of tonic immobility or collapsed mobility when someone's being told that they are dying of a terminal disease. It's been documented when somebody's been in a severe crash of some kind, airplane, car, train. But from my memory of the research, one of, if not the most common experiences that tonic immobility or collapsed mobility is experienced is in rape.
Yeah.
And it happens at a relatively high rate. If I'm remembering right, somewhere between 35 and 45% of victims of rape experience some level of collapsed or tonic immobility. I think that's important to recognize. So I appreciate that you brought it up. And again, fear-based, what it is.
And even thinking, because until you said that, I remember when you first brought that up years ago and I heard it in the presentation, I remember that resonating, but remembering that again does give a sense of like, oh, this is a nice peace of mind of an explanation is really nice. And I always just, I don't know really what I thought about it, but I always just thought like that's my body just is just doing the freeze response and not just shuts down. Because even in the situation where both myself and the other person weren't drinking at all, and we were very much sober, and when I just remember laying on my stomach, crying and just totally frozen. And I was like, why can't you just say afterwards? But in the moment too, I was like, what are you doing? Like, what, to me, like, Ellie, what are you doing? You could say something, you could push him off. And in my mind, I'm like, I'm just stuck here. So that, I feel like that definitely has happened to me in both of those situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are you able to talk a little bit about how it made you feel physically to tell someone else when you were able to finally talk about this?
So, like, the first time when I talked to my roommate about it, I never actually said, I think I was assaulted or I think I was raped or anything like that, because of the response from her was so quick to be blame, blame, blame. And so the first time I was able to talk about it with someone else who understood it, of course, I had told my mom, because I basically called her the next day and said, if you don't pick me up, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, in my mind, I was like, I'm going to kill myself. I can't do this anymore, whatever. So basically, and I only lived an hour and a half away. So I was like, please, I need you to pick me up. And I was clear how serious it was. And so I told her about it. But what the moment that stands out it was a year and a half later, I think, about that timeline, where on my campus there was a organization called the Girl Code Movement, and it was founded by 3 survivors of sexual violence. And they put out on their social media and was like, we're expanding our organization. We'd love to have people join and fight for awareness and like survivors and everything. And so I went to one of the meetings, and I remember showing up, and it was a room full of girls, which was such a relief. I assumed it was probably going to be, but it was nice that there were no men there. None of that was getting brought into this safe space. Because for me at the time, it was like my mind went to like men, danger, like don't want to be around them. And so I went to the meeting, listened to the hour-ish conversation about the organization. And then at the end, one of the girls from so this was my sophomore year, and one of the girls from my freshman year hall was there, who I had been pretty good friends with, but never opened up to her, because she kind of, at the time, was kind of siding with my roommate a little bit. And they all were, said they were concerned about me, but basically I just felt very like judged by this group of people. And so when I saw her there, I went up to her and I was like, I got to tell you something. I was like, I really need to like get this out and be able to kind of like have power over this situation. And so I said, I was assaulted and raped for our freshman year. And she burst into tears, and I burst into tears, and I was like, why are you crying? Don't cry. No, it's okay. And she was like, no, I was assaulted freshman year too. And so we were like, it was like such a moment of sadness, and also it was just an indescribable moment of like, we were friends and we went through our whole freshman years in such pain, so isolated, not telling anyone about it, when really right down the hall was this girl who I was friends with, who was experiencing something very similar. And so when I finally told her, and when she told me, just the crying and the hugging, and then we became just kind of like so outraged at like, why are we so quiet about this? Why is this so unable to be talked about? Why did we go through this alone? And so then we got kind of like mad at just like, I felt like we were just mad at the world. We were just like, what the fuck is happening? I am sick of this. And so that really fueled our involvement in this organization. And yeah, it was a whole ton of emotions: relief, sadness, happiness, pain, anger, shock that this is just happening to so many people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you found someone to confide in that could relate with you.
Yeah.
How has this situation changed your life?
The biggest takeaway, I think, when I think back about my college experience and this freshman year experience, because this is when it all kind of went down, I'm just amazed that I got through it, that I stayed in school, graduated, went on to get my master's. Like, I'm a special ed teacher now, and just my life path, that's what I wanted it to be. When I was going into school, I had really known that I really wanted to be a teacher, and I really wanted to like kind of do well in college. And I mean, I think that's what a lot of people go into college wanting to do well. And basically, when this was all happening, I was like, forget about it. Like, I was thought countless times about dropping out or transferring, or there were times when I was like so close to I had these like kind of like daydreams about jumping on a train and running away, disappearing, not telling anyone where I was going. No one in my world would ever see me again in my mind. I was like, I'm starting fresh. I'm making a whole new. So I had like these really wild like experiences of just like wanting to kill myself, wanting to run away. Just the trauma was so great that like when I look back and realize that I survived that and I'm like living, thriving, like you said, doing really well, having wonderful experiences in my career and with my family and friends and traveling. And it's kind of shocking to me sometimes to be like, wow, like you did it. It's definitely changed my life that way. I think it's changed my life in the sense of really having to relearn trust with men and like trusting the world again, really, because not only men, but also like trusting who I thought were my friends at the time, or like relearning to trust people in general. It's connected to me to an amazing, incredible group of survivors through college, and also the 3 others that I met through the advocacy and the panels that we did. And it's like this really shitty, but also beautiful sisterhood. It's like no one wants to be there. We wouldn't wish it on anyone, but also because we're all there together, it's just this amazing community that I found.
That dichotomy is something I hear a lot about from victims and survivors. In fact, I remember an interview that I did, and it was a male victim, and he said, I am as driven as I am today because of what happened to me. He said, I wouldn't wish this on anyone, and I'm not saying that it was a good thing, but good things came out of it.
Yeah.
And I think I hear the same thing from you, that you've accomplished a lot in spite of what has happened, and maybe even because of what happened, it has been a driving force in your life. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's absolutely brought along friendships that I would have never, ever come across. And I think it's been the advocacy part for me has been such a roller coaster of great times and times where I take breaks because I'm like, why am I doing this to myself? So I think that balance of knowing when I'm good to push forward and advocate, and then also taking time to be like, I'm just going to be Ellie and not survivor Ellie. Almost like sometimes I want to like take that hat off and be like, I'm not talking about anything that happened to me sexual violence related, like and I do a really good, well, I don't know if this is good or not, but in my personal life, I think it's for my own mental health and sanity that I just don't really talk to those in my close circle about it a ton. I really have my like community of support, but the people I see day to day, I just don't really tend to bring that part of me out. I just feels I need a break from it sometimes.
That makes perfect sense to me. And I think to probably our listeners can relate. It's great to hear you again articulate these aspects of what it means to be a survivor and a thriver. I want to congratulate you on what you've accomplished, and thank you for it too.
Thank you.
Ellie, I think that there's much more to talk about, and we only mainly talked about one of your 3 experiences of rape. I'm wondering if there's a possibility you'd be willing to come back for another episode, maybe to kind of revisit maybe some of the things that we've talked about today, but also to explore some of the other issues that may have been different with the other 2 sexual assaults. Is that a possibility? Be on our show again? That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to have a chance too to kind of talk to people that are listening that might not be at the point yet of telling others about their experiences, or like, I just know that when I was first going through this, looking back, it was a time too, like pretty close to around the time that kind of the news started shining light on sexual violence and these advocacy groups started becoming a thing. And so, but there was definitely a few months to close to half a year to a year where I just felt like it wasn't spoken about. I knew no one else that was going through this. And so I'd love to be able to get the chance to kind of on another show or whatever to just say something or just give some support to people who maybe early on in their journeys or not early on, whoever needs to hear it.
You've given a lot of encouragement to people just by being here today, and I think we would love to hear from you again and how these neuroscience issues have impacted you and what you've learned from that. So,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of places we could still go, and I kind of want to wrap this up now with the eye towards having you back.
Yeah, I would love that.
So before we go, obviously we've talked about some pretty emotional things, and I don't want to just hang up and be done and say thank you and goodbye. I want to make sure you're feeling okay and that you're going to be okay after having told your story again and relived some of those feelings and emotions and experiences in your mind. So let me ask you, what were you anticipating your evening would be like after we got through talking?
I think I was definitely nervous about it, about talking, excited and nervous, just a feeling of like advocating again, but also the anxiety of bringing this all back up. And whenever I'm like anxious or my mind's running, like I'll sit and do a crossword puzzle or like go for a walk or just like for me, it's like the best to just stay off my phone and like the social media trap that is. So
yeah.
I think that I'm going to put my phone down and just kind of do something that makes me happy.
I hope that is something you can accomplish. I'm glad
Thank
to hear
you.
you say that. You have a support system, I take it. People that you know you can talk to and feel trust towards them, and maybe could explain to them maybe some of the feelings that you have as we wrap this up and reflecting back on the almost hour that we've been talking now, that you've got some support, an ear to listen and a shoulder to lean on.
Yep.
Great.
Definitely.
I'm glad to hear that. And I'm here for you too. So
thank you.
I think we've experienced that together. We've kind of leaned on each other through the years that have passed since we met each other in person, but we've stayed in touch. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
That does it for another episode of SAS. Thanks for listening. Listen to a new episode each week. And please remember to subscribe, rate each episode, and spread the word about this important podcast, because we all know someone who's been affected by sexual assault or rape. Remember to start by believing, and let's all do our share to help bring justice to victims of rape and sexual assault. We'll talk to you next week.